Thank you for being here. And now that you are here, let me start by telling you a story. If you are surprised by seeing a grandmother in my first slide of the presentation, well, don't switch off or don't drop out of this call. It's just that grandmother is the key protagonist of the story. This is a story from about a year back when I was having this call with a friend of mine in Mumbai. This was a WhatsApp call, late evening India time. I'm having the call from the UK. And I could listen at the background of his side that there was TV running and there was some of his family members chattering around that. Somewhere during the conversation that we were having, I heard that ये तो ज्यादा ही equity पूछ रहा है. And I was like, let's stop I could stop the conversation that I was having with my friend and said like, who said that at the background? Because it felt to me that it was coming from a elderly voice. And there you have the grand entry of the grandmother giving investment advice over what she was seeing on TV. That moment was quite a striking one for me because I was not expecting Indian grandmothers to give investment advice. Because last I saw of grandmothers in my locality, they were hardly even seeing a TV show on entrepreneurship. So what has really sort of changed or moved a needle a bit on that front is shows like Shark Tank, which has made entrepreneurship dinner table conversations within the Indian system and grandmothers becoming active investment advice providers. With that background story to you of how, from a cultural and normative standpoint, we have seen the shift within the ecosystem normalizing entrepreneurship, let me ask you a question. Can you just put in the chat box a number, which is the answer to the question on what do you think is India's ranking globally on best places to start a business? 10 seconds, just throw in a number of where you think India would rank globally on best places to start. I'm not seeing any numbers come up on my end, but maybe Arushi or Tileji,
Yes,
maybe you are
I am. I think some, I see Rohit Junjunwala saying 91, Anuj
91.
Kulkarni saying 5,
Okay.
CA Santaram saying 70 to 80, Dipendu
Okay.
saying 10.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super.
So it
Thanks so much,
ranges.
Arushi, for filling in. Yeah, thank you so much, Arushi, for filling in. So the 5 and 10 are actually close, but it's much better than what you think the number was. India, as per the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor.
3.
Okay, so that's the closest. So as per the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor report that came out earlier this year, which is based on data from last year, we were seeing that India is second best placed when it comes to starting a business. Yes, it is not global in terms of all 180, 200 countries ranked. It's a representative of 49 countries which participated in the survey, but within that, India was in the second position. So that sort of tells us a bit of the reflection in terms of where the ecosystem currently is. And in today's presentation, my objective would be to talk a bit deeper into the insights that we have been capturing from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor report, especially the report that came out earlier this year, talk a bit about what this means, and both from a ecosystem policy angle as well as from practitioner angle, and then talk a bit about what future research opportunities I'm sort of seeing within the Indian entrepreneurship space. With that background, thank you to Professor Tillai and CREST team for inviting me to do the seminar. And let me start by giving you the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor's background. This report and the data behind it has been ongoing for about 25 years now, making it the largest and the longest serving entrepreneurship tracking mechanism over multiple countries. Over 4 million interviews with adult population conducted over a representative sample of 75 odd countries, which have been there for over 5 years. not just population survey, it also is complemented by an expert survey, which experts within the ecosystem, within the country undertake as part of the survey. And this year's report, which is based on data that was collected last year, had 49 countries as part of it and representative across 5 continents, over 135,000 interviews with about 22,000 national experts also contributing to it. So this helps us understand globally how attitudes and trends around entrepreneurship look like today. And I am one among the 9 co-authors who wrote the report this year. What trends are we seeing within the Indian ecosystem? First, Indian ecosystem is among the most supportive when it comes to women entrepreneurs. Second, to be specific, before you come back and say, well, Sreevas, experts can say whatever they want, what does the practical reality look like? Well, the reality is also beginning to reflect these numbers. Because if we looked at this data 20 years ago, as in 2001, we were seeing a 1-to-3 ratio of female to male entrepreneurship, which means that for every one female entrepreneur, there were 3 male entrepreneurs in 2001. But if you look at this year's data, and India sort of is somewhere around here, you kind of see that it's sort of female entrepreneurship is nearing the 10% mark and the male entrepreneurship is just below 15. So we are nearing gender parity when it comes to female to male entrepreneurship within India in terms of total early stage entrepreneurial activity within the country. The other trend that we see is a lot of this entrepreneurship, if you thought was just driven by the 90s kids or the Gen Zs, well, they are driving it a bit more, but then the gap is not that much between the ages of 18 to 34 group, which is predominantly your 90s kids and Gen Z, but the 35 to 64 age group of adults are also sort of giving toe to toe when it comes to starting entrepreneurship. It's just about a 2 percentage point gap between the 2 age groups. So driven more by the Gen Zs and 90s, but the older age group also are starting almost at the equal rate. From a larger ecosystem standpoint, what we are seeing and picking up from the population survey is that about 80% of the respondents believe that it's easy to start a business in India. That's not it. 80% also believed they saw good business opportunities within the region. And that's not it either. Again, an 80% also believed that they have the knowledge to start or the skills to start a new business. And before you ask me to stop and say, well, Sreevas, this sounds too good to be true, wait, picture abhi baki hai, because it's only part of the story. The other part of the story is, even though there is this 80% odd saying there is good opportunities and they have the skills, there is a big fear of failure that is acting as a stumbling block, preventing a lot of these people who think they have the skills to start from actually starting. Because what we also pick up from the survey is that over 60% of the respondents would not start a business because they fear that they might fail. And on that trend too, India is amongst the highest. So India was amongst the highest when it came to people saying they saw opportunities and they thought it is easy to start, but India is also among the highest when it comes to saying there is a lot of fear of failure preventing me from starting a business. And what this does is that it is muting the intention for the people who actually will start, right? So this graph tells you the intention that people say that they have to start, they will do a startup in the next 3 years. And here we see that only about 20% actually say that they actually expect to start in the next 3 years. So while on the one side you had a lot of ambition and confidence in the skill to start, on the other side, having the fear of failure is really sort of suppressing what the other side pushed up. So that duality is something that we need the ecosystem to really think about. Moving on from that trend, if we look at data coming out from the government of India itself, which is from the DPIIT department, over the last decade, it's been a super strong decade, right? I'm sure a lot of the people in this call would also sort of endorse that view, where we have seen over 120,000 startups in the last decade or so coming through. But if you also look at it, these startups have been extremely concentrated when it comes to where they are located. About 60% of them are in 5 states of India. And if you dig deeper, this is not even states at large, it is just few cities within these states where all these entrepreneurs essentially are concentrated. So, yes, we have started more, but we have started more in just few geographical locations. And that's not it. A lot of these entrepreneurs tend to have very muted ambition. And what do I mean by it, and what data do I have for saying this? Again, if you go back to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor report, one of the questions that we ask there is the expectation that the entrepreneurs have when it comes to creating 6 or more jobs. And we see that very, very few, if you see this part of the graph, which is where the India is, very, very few of these entrepreneurs actually expect to create more than 6 jobs in 5 years. So while they might have started, a lot of them are not really thinking to grow or not really think they can grow, which essentially is muting the ambition of growth within these ventures. And that's not it. A lot of these ventures are in the B2C space, which is about 70% that we capture in the data are saying that they are in the retail personal services business. And as you might understand from what these businesses look like, these businesses tend to have lower barriers to entry, which means that there is likely to be more competition, which then means that the margins that you have will be lower, which then consequently means that the potential for you to grow becomes lesser because that's the margins that you are working with. And it's only about 3% or less, which are actually into IT professional services type businesses. Going back to some more good news, which is that Indian entrepreneurs are showing very high resilience, and it's among the top globally. What do I mean by resilience, and what evidence do I have for it? We capture the number of adults who have exited a business in the last 12 months and then ask them whether they intend to start another business in the next 3 years. And when we look at that percentage, we see that 77% for India is among the highest globally when it comes to the percentage of adults who said that they've exited a business, but then they would restart or do some other startup in the next 3 years. That tells us the story of extremely strong and high resilience within the Indian entrepreneurship, which is quite a positive story. If we look at what is really driving the Indian entrepreneurship, there are 2 sides to it. One, a vast chunk of them are actually starting a business because they feel that there is a lack of other opportunities, right? Lack of other jobs, or jobs are being scarce. And that is really what is driving entrepreneurial activity. So that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is equally a high proportion are also looking at entrepreneurship as a means of making a difference in the world or create wealth through it, or looking at it as a continuation of the family tradition. With the long history of family business and business communities within India, some of these trends lend itself to that, what we have seen from those trends in the past. So 2 sides to it, job scarcity driving it, and then equally a good percentage looking at it as a means of making a difference in the world. Having looked at all these trends, what does all this mean? The first input that I take out from looking at these trends is, yes, over the last few years, we have done a lot of work in the ecosystem really to push the interest towards entrepreneurship, create the cultural narrative around it, making it interesting and relevant for people to explore this as a career opportunity. But the fact that high fear of failure is acting as a stumbling block needs to be something that we start to give a lot more focus on. So what can we really do to remove the stigma attached to failure, if you want to call it failure in the first place, around entrepreneurship not working out? In fact, can we go beyond just removing the stigma and in fact create some form of cushion to support these entrepreneurs who are, let's say, shutting their entrepreneurial venture and then trying to explore a conventional employment opportunity? Can we talk about failure not as failure, but as learning more openly? Essentially, kind of call them into sessions like this and ask them to share their experience, even though they have shut shop, and not just celebrate the ones which have made unicorn status. Can we create a pathway for re-entering from self-employment back to employeeship? Things to ponder over. The other trend is, over the last couple of decades, the push has increased the number of people who are starting up, but then not a lot of them are growing, or not having the ambition to grow, or not having the ability to grow for a number of reasons. So are we now at a stage where we think from incubation focus? Yes, the incubation centers are needed, but can we also think about maybe starting an acceleration center, or create cohort-based sector-wise growth programs at top universities, and even incubators itself? How can we ensure the long-term sustenance of these incubators? Because a lot of these incubators, if you look at the report that the white paper that Rohan and others had put out earlier this year, kind of says that initial 4 or 5 years you have the funding from the government, but then what happens after that initial period, and how do they sustain in the longer period, are areas of both practical policy interest as well as research interest. Third is, given the high concentration of entrepreneurship that we are seeing in a few states and in fact few cities, what can we do to democratize entrepreneurship support, essential to spur more of it in tier 4, tier 5 towns and rural areas? What we probably not need is just another training program. I mean, there's this rural training programs that the government does. So it's not just another training program that we need, but we need closer engagement with communities for community-led venturing, creating ventures that are linked to local issues, which are more sustainably sourced, and all of that. Maybe one route is expanding more of the Atal community innovation centers, or maybe do a lot more engaged, embedded initiatives with local communities, which will help us democratize entrepreneurship support into tier 4, tier 5, and rural areas. Personally, my big bets for some of this to happen is on conversational AI, which I think would help remove some of the language barriers holding back Indian entrepreneurs, especially in the regional language states, to engage with it. So that, alongside ONDC creating the market visibility and discoverability, would be one of the big bets that I have for a lot more entrepreneurial activity, especially democratizing entrepreneurship in the next 5-10 years. And illustratively, my hope would be creating an Estonia-like setup within Tenkasi, given what Soho has already done there, and building on from that, creating a Shanghai out of Gift City. I was recently told that Ayodhya already had, 5 times religious tourism revenue than Vatican already. So can we think about phygital tourism, combining physical spaces, physical religious sites or heritage sites, with digital twinning of these sites, to create phygital tourism models and create a lot more of those culturally oriented entrepreneurship type opportunities? These are some of my illustrative hopes for the next 5 to 10 years. Now, talking about what research opportunities I see within this space. One which I'm currently engaging and sort of doing a bit of work is looking at entrepreneurship from the sort of non-Western lens. Within that, I'm doing a bit of work around rural entrepreneurship and cultural entrepreneurship. So I see a lot of potential for that space of what we could do from within India. And there's also, within non-Western perspective space, opportunities for us to look at family dynamics, context dynamics, and how that is influencing entrepreneurship, given the long legacy that we have of both family businesses as well as business communities. Digital entrepreneurship, not a big surprise, given all the hype around AI and the rest of it. But what I think is a lot more unique and interesting elements where we could focus on is around the intersection of digital public goods, which is your UPI, ONDC, and how that is influencing entrepreneurship. Let's say ONDC influencing informal entrepreneurship getting formalized, or UPI influencing the payment infrastructure created around UPI, how that is influencing entrepreneurial activity. So those, I think, are extremely interesting areas for us to explore. And the Instagram world of India, I've just been a passive observer of it. I don't know exactly how a lot of them work, but the whole space around the influencer-led entrepreneurship, D2C space in India is doing a whole different level of play, at least in terms of what I've observed from the few reels that I end up seeing. And I think there's a lot that we could do in that space of how all this D2C influencer-led entrepreneurship is playing out within the Indian space. From a larger entrepreneurship ecosystem research standpoint, there is a lot, as I mentioned also in one of the previous slides, to look at now what does 1,000 odd incubators, almost every university has an incubator. So what role and nature does all these incubators have? There is a lot of data, right, with all these 1,000 odd incubators. So there's a lot of potential in looking at this incubator data to look at what support mechanisms help in doing what, how do they work, all of that, and what impact they've had on entrepreneurship. There's a big space of what could be done around that. And linked to it is also not just the university element, but the corporate startup accelerator type initiative. So Cisco has a startup initiative, Microsoft has an accelerator initiative, Google has an accelerator initiative. So how is the intersection between these multinational corporate accelerators engaging with startups within India? How do their interactions and activities work and operate is another area which I think is of a lot of potential research. And from an entrepreneurship policy angle, there is immense scope for quantitative data comparisons between policy impact and how that is playing out within the market. And the other interesting element, which I've been picking up in some of my recent conversation, is the investor motivations. And in some cases, these investor motivations work in different ways, depending on sector, category, investors' own background interest, their contextual background. I think there were some interesting plays of nitbits that I was picking up from this conversation. So I think there is a lot of potential for research in that space too. Thinking about where could data for all this research come from, one is Wino's venture engine itself. And if you might have seen this in the poster for this presentation already, but if you haven't noticed it, do explore what Professor Tillai, Ramesh, and the Wino's team have put together, because that, I believe, is an extremely rich data set that's been pulled together. Super kudos to the team in putting that together, because it's quite an effort to actually pull that all together. So I think that could be one of the good data sets to explore in terms of what you do to explore some of these questions or others within the Indian ecosystem. Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which I've been talking about for the initial part of this, is another option. Traction has a lot of the funding information. So looking at multiple data sets, integrating them could be one way of looking at doing quantitative secondary data sets based entrepreneurship research within India. And if you're looking at more early stage phenomenon like cultural entrepreneurship and rural entrepreneurship, there's a lot of scope for qualitative case study based research to look at how early stage phenomenon, which we don't know much about, can really be explored and understood in greater depth. And my final point, which is also a sort of call to action that I have for all of us in this call, particularly the people from the academic research background, is can we start doing a lot more of research design based engagements with entrepreneurs, where we collect data parallelly to engagements that we have with the entrepreneurs in the first place. Because now almost every university has an incubator, right? So the access to entrepreneur is no longer a big problem, because all the universities almost have an incubator. There is a lot more entrepreneurial activity happening within the country. But where I see there, especially when I'm seeing this from the side of an editor, or when I'm seeing this from the side of a reviewer, the scale or the scope of the research questions that gets asked are sometimes needing a lot more advancement, particularly from the point of view of what the scope of the question could be. So the ask and the call for action is essentially, can we think about designing experiments, designing data collection methods which are drawing on, let's say, big data based methods, or drawing on sort of diary based research, reflections from entrepreneurs, looking at alternate research methods, scope of the questions being larger, and trying to inform and write to what the narratives within leading entrepreneurship journals are. I think there's immense potential now with the access that we have. And that's the real call for action that I have in terms of really shifting the needle within the Indian entrepreneurship research focused topics. With that, I will bring my session to a close. Dhanyavadaha. Thank you.